What if we could rid ourselves of unnecessary rules and banish some of the bureaucracy that gets in our way? Our guest today is an expert, and he's going to help us think about the correlation between bureaucracy and rules and a lack of productivity. Are you ready for today's Remarkable Leadership Podcast? Let's go. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you see the world differently, lead more confidently, and make a bigger difference both professionally and personally. And because you come here to grow as a leader, I'm excited to tell you about Virtual LeaderCon, which we have created and are hosting September 14th through 18th, 2020. If you want the very latest thinking from the top leadership experts with the chance to interact with them and ask your questions, wherever you are from the device of your choice, you will not want to miss this event. Best of all, you can watch it all live for free. Go to remarkablepodcast.com/VLC to learn more and get your free pass. That's remarkablepodcast.com/VLC. We'll see you there. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So glad you're here. And you're going to be really glad you're here when you meet our guest. My guest today is Gary Hamel. He's a longtime faculty member of the London Business School. He's authored 20 articles for the Harvard Business Review, published 5 books with Harvard Business Review Press, including The Future of Management, which was named Amazon's Business Book of the Year. And I'm a fan of that book. We're not going to talk about that book necessarily today, though. The Wall Street Journal ranked him as the world's most influential business thinker. And the Financial Times labeled him as a management innovator without peer. As a consultant, he's helped dozens of the world's most recognized companies increase their capacity for innovation and strategic renewal. He's done all sorts of great stuff. Today, he's on our show. I want to talk to him today about his brand new book, which he wrote with Michele Zanini. It's a book called Humanocracy, creating organizations as amazing as the people inside them. And the book is, as this is being released, the book is brand new. It's just out. And he lives in Northern California, where I once lived. And today, he's a guest right here. Gary, welcome.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be with you, Kevin, and with all of your listeners.
I don't, not everyone gets hailed as a management innovator without peer or being named highly influential, most influential business thinker. And I'm guessing that when you were 8, that you weren't thinking that was where you were headed. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up doing this, like just a little bit about your journey to how you ended up doing this work and working with organizations and writing books. Just a little bit about how that all happened.
Sure, Kevin, I can give you a little potted history. I mean, I was lucky enough to grow up with parents who were super curious, who were very well read, and who encouraged a lot of far-reaching conversations around the dinner table. So I guess kind of curiosity was bred into me fairly early. I think one of the real inflection points in my career was when I was doing a PhD program at the University of Michigan in the late 1970s. And really at that point, for the first time in history, American industry was being challenged by global competitors in a way that had never happened before. And I watched as Ford and GM and so on were pummeled as they lost market share and really continue to lose market share. And a new breed of competitors, mostly from Japan, changed the rules of the game. And I think what that got me thinking about 2 things. One is that success is very, very fragile, that even a 100-year-old organization is always poised on the verge of kind of irrelevance or crisis. But the second was that when a company loses its mojo, there is a deep personal impact of that. And you could see the families that were pulled apart, the incomes that were lost, the urban decay that came with that. And so from business being primarily an intellectual mind game, I really understood the deep human element of it. And I think that has stuck with me and is very much the heart of the new book.
I just heard the other day, and of course we're recording this for everyone listening. We're recording this a little bit before it's actually coming out, but I just heard the other day that Tesla has a higher market value than Ford, which is just, it's mind blowing. Now that isn't necessarily the only way we could measure, but it's to your point that that conversation that you started with in the 1970s is not really ended. The competitors may not be in Japan anymore, all of them, but that hasn't necessarily changed. You know, I'm a positive thinker by nature, and I believe that there's always opportunities to make things better. I know that you do too, just because I've read your work, and we'll get to that in the book. But you know, there's some things that are true that I think are probably at the heart of what you're doing here, and that is, 20% of employees don't. Only 20% of people think that their opinions matter at work. Very few people, less than 10% of people, feel like they have the freedom to try, experiment at work. 70% of jobs have very little originality. They're just sort of rote, many of them very rote. And, the numbers of who really feels engaged in the workplace are not high. I mean, these are just, we hear them over and over. They're sort of true. And so you're bringing out this book that's called Humanocracy. And really, as I read it, it's, you can disagree. You wrote it. It's a treatise against bureaucracy. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's both the kind of manifesto for building something better, but it's also an indictment for the kind of management system that we have that, as you so rightly point out, Kevin, probably in many organizations squanders more human capacity than it uses. And I don't think this has ever been defensible, but clearly now it is intolerable, given partly that we are awake more and more as a society to the need to create dignity and opportunity and equity for everyone in society. It's intolerable in that you simply cannot compete in a creative economy, a network-based world with those old hierarchical top-down structures. And it's intolerable because we've seen now a couple of decades of declining productivity growth, which has huge implications for standard of living and so on. And unless we unleash that capability, we're not going to get that productivity growth on an accelerating path again. So there are many things that come together that I think make this a critical challenge now for individuals, for society, for organizations. And but at the heart of it is exactly what you say, that at work, people show up physically, they do their job, they are diligent, they're smart, but the things that matter most, certainly today, the initiative, the imagination, the daring, people leave most of that at home. That's just an empirical fact, and that's not their fault. Those things are gifts which people either choose to bring to work or not, and the data says that most people on most days choose not to bring them to work, and because the work environments they're in really don't elicit those things, they don't deserve those things, they don't reward those things, and so those gifts don't show up. So changing that is the goal of the book, and I think it's an imperative that has always been important, but maybe now more than ever.
So you said something, and I've read it, so I know, but some people might be surprised by something you said early there when you said we are not really improving productivity. Like, we've had all these things that are supposed to improve productivity. We got computers, we got the internet, we got AI, we got all this stuff. Like, what you're telling me, and I'm teasing with you here a little bit. You're telling me that productivity is not getting better. Why is that true?
Well, there's a lot of debate around this and a lot of diagnosis, and I would refer, to other experts perhaps on this. But I do think that most economists would agree that we've had, steadily declining productivity growth. Now, productivity itself is still nudging up, but the rate at which it's growing has come down markedly over the last few decades. And certainly, I would argue that a big part of that is bureaucracy. And let me give you some data. Between 1983 and 2008, the number of bureaucrats in the U.S. workforce, these are managers, administrators, supervisors, we call them the kind of bureaucratic class. But the number of administrators in the U.S. economy in the workforce has doubled over that time period, while all other categories of employment have grown by less than 50%. So our economy is becoming more and more bureaucratic. And when we unpack that in our research, what we discover is, contrary to I think what's often assumed, that is not primarily a matter of more government regulation. That what is really growing there is internal bureaucracy, more meetings, more KPIs, more layers, more staff groups, new CXOs who build their own fiefdoms. And so bureaucracy, for reasons perhaps we'll talk about, But bureaucracy is self-perpetuating, and it's like a ratchet, just like it goes and goes and goes. And so I think that it's not uncorrelated that as bureaucracy has gone up, as we've gotten more authoritarian structures, more rules, more things separating employees from the customer in the marketplaces, as bureaucracy has grown, productivity has declined. And certainly on the way we look at it, we think there's about a $3.5 trillion of economic loss every year, of lost GDP due to an excess of bureaucracy. And if we were able to wring that out of the economy over the next decade in increments, we would more than double the recent lackluster productivity growth rate. So we think there is cause and effect there. We think this puts an enormous damper on human initiative and ingenuity at work. The data you cited backs that up. There's other data as well. And so for us, this is kind of paramount to getting the real payoff. You know, you talk, Kevin, about all these new tools, and for sure, you know, we're all using them. You know, we all have Slack or Microsoft
using
Teams
them right now, right? As we speak.
Yeah, we're using it, you know, Zoom right now. But if you think about a lot of these tools, they're basically the equivalent of like Microsoft Office in the 80s. So Microsoft Office brought, you know, productivity to individual white collar workers. These new tools are bringing productivity gains to teams as opposed to individuals. But most of those teams are still working inside of organizations that fit that old bureaucratic model where power trickles down, big leaders appoint little leaders, people compete for the scarce resource of promotion, staff groups create a lot of rules, managers assign tasks and assess performance. So we've kind of layered these things on, you know, new kinds of technology. We've layered that onto that old organizational model, but we really haven't changed the model itself.
You said something, there's something that you mentioned briefly that I really liked in the book, and I wanted to say a little bit more and have you say a little bit more about. You said, you know, we get CXOs, C whatever O's, and they build their fiefdom. You made and you also said that bureaucracy is self-perpetuating. And here's the insight that I got. One of the insights I got from the book. We have a problem, we have an issue, and so we identify and we'll put someone to be the chief in charge of that issue. CXO, right? But once we do that, rather than thinking about that like a project or an initiative or a battle to be won, even if you want, once we put a title on someone, then they're going to say, well, we can't take that away now because now it's part of the organization. You will say it more elegantly than I just did, but I thought that was a really valuable idea, that even how we frame it when we realize we have an issue is setting ourselves up to create more bureaucracy. Again, say more better than I just said.
If you're operating from an assumption or a reality that most people in the organization are incapable of dealing with new unexpected issues, then the only way you deal with those is you have a new senior position and a staff and so on. And of course, I think what has happened is we've systematically undermined the capability of our organizations on the front lines to do the right thing, to be responsive and so on. Definitely not the fault of those employees. But if you have an organization that is not responsive in that way, then the only approach is like more bureaucracy. And I think beyond even, you know, creating these additional organizational units, I think there's perhaps, Kevin, even a deeper thing at work, which is that people in power generally are reluctant to give it up, and in fact are often well positioned to get more of it. And so when you really talk about rolling back bureaucracy across an economy or in an individual organization, you're really talking about reallocating authority and reallocating power. And that's a very difficult, challenging thing to do. And if you look at this long history of organizational innovation over the last 60 years, all the things we've tried from way back, things like T groups and socio-technical systems up to TQM and so on, all the way up to mindfulness, agile teams, and everything in between. And you ask, well, why hasn't that made a real difference? Why aren't our organizations more capable than they are? And again, the reality is all of those things are nice, like bolt-ons and add-ons, but none of them change the fundamental power structure. And I think what a lot of CEOs are finally realizing and are awake to the ideas we present in the book is they're finally willing to admit that you cannot win in a networked world with a hierarchical organization. By the time an issue, you know, works its way up the pyramid, gets big enough so somebody at the top says, yes, this is important, we have to do something about it. By that time, you are already on the back foot, and increasingly, you will never catch up, which is why usually what we call change programs are almost always catch-up programs. So the heart of our argument in the book, and it's a very tough one to make, and I'm happy to go deeper, is that we really have to rethink power. Who has it? How do you get it? How do you use it? But the idea that power is attached to positions, that it's binary, that the way you get power is that you kiss up, you please the boss, that is toxic in so many ways to what our organizations need to do today, that it simply cannot persist. It's as out of date today as aristocracy was in the early 19th century.
So 2 observations as I'm listening to that. One is that here's the paradox, and you talk about it in the book, and you just outlined it for people, that everybody, I mean, pretty much everybody would say, we need to get rid of bureaucracy. Everyone agrees with that idea, but not mine. Like, change this, but whoa, don't take away my power. Don't take away my authority. Don't take away my budget. And there's where we get into the problem. So the other observation, then I want to come back to that, but I want to make another observation I just can't shake in my head. Another person that we both know, Tom Peters, wrote with Bob Waterman in 1983, and In Search of Excellence, about one of the many things they wrote about was this idea of skunk works. Take away, let people go work on something. And I hear it all the time in our organization of 12 or 15 people, like, you can get so much done, right? Same idea. Without all of that other layers, without all of those approvals, without all the other stuff, it allows you to get things done. And that's what they were talking about in 1983. It's what we're still talking about. We still can't get there, at least not everybody consistently. So that's just an observation. So you talk in the book about this whole, how this all comes about. And I loved, as an author, I love how people come up with ways to create a hook. And you talk about BMI, and most people talk about body mass index, but you have a different meaning for what BMI means. And I think it's critical to all of us listening to you right now to start to think about what's going on in our own organizations, right? So talk about what BMI is, and just a little bit about what some of the pieces of it are, because I think it's a brilliant way for us to think about it.
Well, all of us, we tend to pay, particularly in business, we tend to pay attention to things that can be measured. And the reality is most of the costs of bureaucracy don't show up on the P&L. A few of them do, like maybe too many layers, or the staff groups have become too big. So some of those headcount issues that you may see. But what you don't see is the inbuilt conservatism that comes from people who are afraid to speak up. You don't see the insularity when you have multiple layers who really are not accountable to the marketplace. You don't see the risk aversion where people play it safe every day. You don't see the cost of all that internal politicking, which is all about jockeying for position but not creating value. Those costs are invisible in most organizations. So the BMI, the Bureaucratic Mass Index, is simply a tool we built, and anybody who goes to hbr.org and puts in my name or BMI, you can probably find it there and you can take it. It's all free. But it's simply a way of starting to calibrate what kind of bureaucratic drag do I have in my organization, and is bureaucracy going up and down? You'll know, your listeners will know that until recently, most companies didn't measure their environmental impact. And now, over the last decade or so, most do. And I think it's similar here. If, as we believe, that bureaucracy is this enormous drag on the economy, and I should say, if you look at all the so-called kind of vulture capitalists, if you look at all the activist investors over the last few years who've gone after a lot of big companies and have challenged, have tried to win board seats, and you look at their indictment of large companies, it's basically the same indictment we have in the book. They're too slow, they're too many layers, they're too conservative, they're too arrogant. And so kind of collectively, we understand that's a huge problem in our economy, but we really haven't yet had a way of measuring it and tracking it. And my hope is that stakeholders will put increasing pressure on company and employees to say, what are we doing with that number? Is it going down? Because as it goes down, human capacity at work is going to go up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, we've really been talking about the first part of the book, making the case, talking about the size of the problem and what the problem is. But then you talk about some things that can help. And that's where I want us to spend the last little bit of our time, Gary, is because not everyone who's listening, because many of you are listening and you're saying, okay, I need to get the CEO to read this. And I don't want you to just stop there, because there are things that you guys in the book that you guys have described. You talk about, I think it's 7 or 8 powers, things that we can do to help wherever we are. And we could talk about any of them, but I'm going to pick two because we only have so much time. Can we, and I did not tell you ahead, so everybody, Gary's working without a net here. Can we talk about the community power a bit? What do you mean by that? And how can that help us as individual leaders move the ball in our organizations?
Yeah, sure, Kevin. Well, the argument is we talk about, you're right, we talk about 7 principles in the book. And the thought is that, layering on more practices and processes onto that old bureaucratic rootstock is not going to help. We have to go back to first principles. And bureaucracy was built around principles like standardization, specialization, formalization. Those aren't all bad, but they're inadequate given the challenges we face now. And so we have to embrace new principles. Community is one of those principles. And then everybody, not a few people at the top, everybody, every day in their teams, they're part of the organization, has to ask, what would we do differently if we took that principle seriously? So if you take the principle of community, it's important, first of all, because as human beings, we generally do our best work when we feel we are in a community. That is an intimate, closely connected group of people who are friends as well as colleagues, who are willing to take risks with each other, who have each other's back, where there's very little hierarchy, and very much that sense of being in it together. There are a small number of companies that do very well at creating that. Southwest Airlines is one, and we talk about them in the book and how that they create that sense of kind of family at scale. But you can start to ask this question of how do you build community in any part of an organization? And so the challenge is, pick the principle that resonates with you. It might be community. It might be, we talk about experimentation and openness and so on. But then ask, within my team, how do I start to experiment with that? For example, one of the things that's very important in community is you actually take the time to understand the story of people around you. And so I was very much struck by the ex-CEO of Nucor, who started out, just as an operator at Nucor, the America's most profitable steel company, and they are very much a community. And he gave me his simple tip. He said when he was a young leader or becoming a leader at Nucor, whenever he met an employee, he said the first meeting I had was all about them. I wanted to know their family, what challenges they faced, what their life was like. We did not talk about work at all. I talked about them, who they were as human beings, what their dreams were. He said the second meeting, I would talk about me, but mostly mistakes I'd made, vulnerabilities, fears I had, but I wanted to open up and be vulnerable to that person. And only the third conversation would we talk about business. And then what I would be asking them is, what do I do to help you? What are the challenges you're up against? I wasn't giving orders. I wasn't giving my diagnosis. And so you think about how that vulnerability, that openness, that concern for somebody else starts to build those bonds of community. And so what we're trying to do in the book is take this away from a conversation about, well, when my CEO finally reads this or somebody else. No. Organizations change when people say, I'm willing to change something right here, right now. Other people see those changes. When they work, they scale up, they propagate. But it's really taking that responsibility to be an activist right where you are, rather than hoping that one day some the CTO, the CFO, the head of HR is going to change your organization. That is not going to happen. I can tell you, it is not going to happen. Your organization will change to the extent you are willing to start to make that change where you are, and you engage other people around it. And community is one of the best places to start, because it's crazy if you think about it. The thing that's most important to us as human beings is relationships. And that's most important to us is the love inside of those relationships. And you think about somebody at Herb Kelleher at Southwest Airlines who could say a company is stronger when it's bound together with love instead of fear. I know almost nobody who works in organizations who's willing to stand up and have a conversation about love. We somehow ended up with organizations that are so banal that we really can't even talk about what's most important to us as human beings. So change starts to happen when you say, I'm going to play by different rules. This is my responsibility. I'll start this where I am.
Two observations. First is everything. If you all have the advantage that I don't have, because you can hit stop and go back and listen to that again. And if you listen to what Gary just said, he's describing that when he talks about the CEO at Nucor, he's describing how you build trust. And you talk about building trust, and it connects to almost all of the other powers or core principles that they talk about in the book, including creating ownership, including creating openness, including creating experimentation. If I'm that other person, and I've had that experience with my supervisor, with my boss, with my manager, with my leader, call us whatever you want to call us, you're creating the opportunity for all those things to happen. And all of us can do that, because every one of you that's listening is a leader, probably by role, probably by title, but almost assuredly by role. The other thing that I would say, and one of the reasons I picked community, is it's especially important to me. I would like to hope that my team would give us high marks on it. But the other thing is that I think that in our world today, it is so missing. People are more isolated than ever. And I'm not just talking about working from home because of COVID, although I am talking about that. I'm not talking about that. People feel more isolated. People feel more alone, even in a world with social media and all the other stuff. A huge percentage of us live alone. And I think that when we can create that at work, it's doing something for the humans in the humanocracy, not just for what it creates in terms of how we feel better at work and how we create better work and all of those tremendous things. It's doing something for the planet that unfortunately I think is missing. So I don't know. You're supposed to be the one talking here, not me, Gary. But comments about that?
Well, I agree with you. You know, one of the pieces of data I came across doing research for the book, Gallup says that only 2 out of 10 people say they have a close friend at work. And we've kind of been told that, we're supposed to keep work and our private lives separate. Now, of course, work intrudes on our private life all the time, but that's really supposed to be only one way. Don't take your problems to work. Having said that, if you're going through a divorce, if you have a child struggling with addiction, if you've just received a challenging diagnosis, the expectation that I'm going to go to work and I'm not going to find anybody there for 8 or 10 hours that will talk to me about this, like human to human, that's bad for me. That's bad for my work. That's bad for the planet. So I 100% agree. And I don't think, work should entirely invade the personal nor vice versa. But we have to find a synthesis in there where we can bring our soul to work and not only our brains and our brawn. And that is mostly missing. And I think we can rebuild it. And I think you're absolutely right, Kevin, to say that is maybe the essential work of a leader. And I think what we're slowly recognizing, clearly the premise of the book, is that our organizations have been incapacitated by their inhumanity. That they are less resilient than we are as human beings in our personal lives. They're certainly less creative than we are in our lives. They are less other-centered than we are in our lives. And our organizations suffer because of that. And it's just becoming untenable to us as individuals, to our society, competitively, and so on. And so rehumanizing work, that is my passion. And I think what has made it difficult is we've kind of talked about that issue for a long time. You started out talking about that engagement data, less than 20% people engaged in their work. That data hasn't changed in 60 years. That hasn't changed. I mean, apart from Tom Peters, dear friend, go all the way back to Douglas McGregor, The Human Side of Enterprise. That data has not changed, because we have not stood up and said, bureaucracy has to die. This is not something we can solve fiddling at the edges. And this is not an either or. One of the amazing things we've learned through our work and through our research is when you get rid of formal hierarchy, when you build a hierarchy that's truly a hierarchy of expertise, a hierarchy of wisdom, a hierarchy of innovation, you find that everybody's job gets better. I don't know of any leader that wakes up every day saying, I'm going to get off micromanaging other people today. I want to be in their business all day long. In fact, we know from that same Gallup data that managers are even less engaged than the people they're supervising. So when you start to change that, leaders have the chance to be leaders. They have the chance to mentor people. They have the chance to be system architects and think about how do you make this work better for everybody. They have the chance to become great mentors for innovation. So they're doing the real work of leadership. Today, the idea of leadership and management is so hopelessly confused that mostly when we're talking about leaders, we're talking about administrators. Well, some of those people are leaders, many of them are not. But kind of getting rid of the bureaucracy, learning how to get the benefits, the control, the coordination, and so on, but without all of those costs, that is going to unleash the talent of real leaders, and we're going to find the real leaders merge to the top rather than just the best bureaucratic infighters. I just have to say this, one of the most kind of depressing statistics that came out of all of this was a survey we did with Harvard Business Review, 10,000 respondents, and 76% of them said the primary way you get ahead in my organization is to become a better bureaucrat. You hoard resources, you manage up, you manage the optics of your own performance, you stiff arm others. I mean, like, if that's really true, or even if people believe it and that's the way you get ahead, like, that's like, none of us want to live in that world. And so we just have to have the courage to say the old model dies. We need something in our organization that is as different from that bureaucratic model as Netflix is from 3-channel television 30 years ago. And once we're over that hump and say, okay, it has to die, we have to do something better, then you're going to find there's a lot of exemplars. This is not rocket science. You don't have to blow everything up. It's going to be a migration. But then you have the courage, the confidence to say, all right, let's start to work for something better.
I don't know a better place to stop. We're not quite done, everybody, but I just want to say this. Have I had a guest who's been more passionate? I don't know. And Gary, I hear it, and I'm right with you 100%. And I want to say this to everybody about the book, that I think it's 2 books. There's the front part of the book that is making the case, that's giving us the data, that's thinking about this at the macro level, all of the things that Gary shared with you here. But if that part isn't the part that turns you on, you can just go back about a third of the way, and you can get right into the details about openness and experimentation and community, and we can market, and we can go right on through all those things. So there's 2 books in one. I believe you want to read both, but even if only one or the other turns you on, I'm sure Gary would be happy if you just picked the one that you wanted to read. So before we go, Gary, a couple more things. What do you do for fun? I mean, clearly, you're like me. You love your work, but there's more than that. You just said that work and personal life, they bleed together. So, like, okay, tell us a little bit about the personal side. What do you do for fun?
Well, as you might imagine, writing a book, your personal life does get a little bit shortchanged in that. But I think since I was a little kid, I love to ski. I do that every chance I get, the toughest runs I can find. Love to scuba dive, do a lot of that. Love to hike and be outdoors and live in a place, luckily, where that's possible. So, I think that all of us, we need something, experiences that are bigger than we are, that fill up all of our senses, that clear our minds. So I have some things that are those are the things that I do to kind of keep the soul and heart together through all of this.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And so, as I always do, I'm going to ask you this question. What do you do? What do you read? What are you reading now? What's something you're reading right now or have read recently?
So I don't really read any business books anymore. I haven't for some long time. I try to read things, though, that will help me think about business differently. A couple of things that have been very interesting is Thomas Nagel, the late Thomas Nagel's book on mind and cosmos, and really thinking through, where consciousness comes from. I've loved David Bentley Hart's recent book, I think also a bestseller, called The Experience of God, and talking about how in an increasingly secular world, what's the importance of still having a spiritual, a metaphysical side to ourselves to keep us sane and whole. So those have been 2 particularly interesting books. I also just finished reading, I'm sorry, I will not remember the author, but I believe, it's a history of Churchill during the Blitz. I think it's called The Splendid and the Vile. And obviously he's one of, that was the 20th century's most iconic leaders. But if you want a study in how you preserve courage and a positive attitude through the worst possible circumstances, that's also just an extraordinary book from which I learned a lot.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Gary. You mentioned go to HBR and search on your name, but where can people learn more about your work, get the book, anything you want to say about any of that?
Yeah, well, you can always find stuff on my website, GaryHamel.com. We put videos and content there. For people who like the book, we're going to have a free webinar, a free open course, which you can also find at my website. That should be up by the time people are watching this. You can do an entire course around humanocracy. You can build, you can learn how to hack management in your organization, launch an experiment, get your colleagues on board. So we're going to try to go from the book to some real tools and things that allow you to share this and make it accessible to everybody across your organization. So yeah, the website, you could also go to humanocracy.com, and then all the usual places on social media. People can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, and happy to be in touch with people who are on this journey and are excited as I am to kind of turn the management model upside down.
And so that's where I want to close, because just listening to us, listening to Gary isn't enough. What you really need to do is take some action. So the question is, now what? What are you going to do as a result of this? Maybe you're going to take that course, you're going to get a copy of the book, all that. But I'm talking about, what did you take from our time that you are going to take action on? What idea, what insight can you turn from, oh, that's a good idea, into taking some action? Wherever you are in your own leadership journey, there were lessons and ideas here for you. The challenge for you is to take some action. I hope that you'll do that. Gary, thanks so much for being here, man. It was a super pleasure to have you, and had a great time. Hope you did as well.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. So everybody, we'd love to have you join this conversation. You know, we're here every week, and so you want to come back, but you also can have a hand in what we're doing. Find out the latest, comment, and make conversation with us on either of our social media groups, either on Facebook or LinkedIn. Take your pick, whichever you prefer. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to join us. We hope you'll do that. And we hope you'll be back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.